A 72-year-old woman returns to her childhood home after her brother's sudden death, expecting nothing but silence and memories. But hidden behind a wall, she uncovers a secret her family buried for decades, one that could change everything she thought she knew. What she finds next isn't just the truth, it's a warning. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ruth Lancaster was 72 years old the morning everything began to unravel, and she had no idea her entire life was built on something fragile enough to collapse in a single afternoon. She lived alone in a quiet coastal town in Maine, where the ocean whispered the same familiar rhythm she had trusted for decades. Her days were predictable, almost painfully so. Morning tea by the window, old books stacked neatly by her chair. The kind of life people called peaceful, but beneath it was something far more dangerous: certainty. Ruth had spent 40 years as a school principal, guiding generations of children, believing that truth mattered, that honesty built strong foundations. She believed her own life was proof of that. She believed she knew her family. She believed she understood her past. She was wrong. Because hidden somewhere inside the house she had just inherited, buried beneath dust, silence, and decades of careful avoidance, was something that had been waiting for her, not by accident, not by chance, but by design. And once she found it, there would be no going back. What Ruth was about to uncover wouldn't just change how she saw her father. It would force her to question whether anything she had ever believed was real. Ruth Lancaster did not cry when she got the call. The voice on the phone was steady, clinical, too steady for something that was supposed to break a life in half. Her younger brother, Thomas, had died suddenly in his sleep. No warning, no time to prepare, just gone. Ruth thanked the caller, hung up, and stood motionless in her quiet kitchen, her hand still resting on the counter. Thomas had always been the one who stayed behind. While she built a life elsewhere, structured, predictable, safe, he remained in their childhood home in Pennsylvania, the keeper of memories, the one who never left. And now the house was hers. 3 days later, Ruth stood in front of it. The place looked frozen in time, the same pale siding, the same narrow porch. Even the wind seemed to move around it carefully, as if unwilling to disturb whatever still lingered there. She stepped inside. The air was still but not abandoned. Everything was in place, too much in place. Thomas had always been organized, but this felt deliberate, like someone had arranged the house not for living but for observation. Ruth moved slowly, her eyes scanning every detail. A chair slightly angled, a book placed just a little too precisely, the kind of details most people would miss. But she didn't, because something wasn't right, and she could feel it. By late afternoon, she found herself in the study. It had always been their father's room, the one space in the house that had rules no one spoke out loud. Even as a child, Ruth had known not to touch certain things, not to move certain objects. That instinct came back to her now stronger than ever. The room was lined with bookshelves, floor to ceiling, old wood, darkened with time. She approached them slowly. At first glance, nothing stood out. Rows of books, neatly arranged, some she remembered, some she didn't. But then, her hand paused midair. One section of the shelf felt wrong. Not visibly, not obviously, but something about the spacing, the alignment. It was too perfect. Ruth narrowed her eyes and stepped closer. She ran her fingers along the edge of the shelf, and then she felt it. A slight shift, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. She pressed gently. Nothing. She pressed again, this time with intention. A soft click echoed through the room. Ruth froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire section of the bookshelf moved. Not much, just enough. A narrow gap appeared between the wood and the wall behind it. Ruth's breath slowed. She didn't step back. She stepped closer. Because now she knew. This wasn't an accident. This had been built. Designed. Hidden. She placed both hands on the shelf and pushed. It shifted further, revealing a small, concealed compartment carved directly into the wall. Dark, sealed, waiting. Ruth stood there, staring at it. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady. Too steady. The kind of calm that comes right before something changes forever. She reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something solid. A box. Not large, but heavy. She pulled it out slowly, placing it on the desk behind her. Dust had gathered around the edges of the compartment, but not inside it. Which meant one thing. This had been accessed. Not long ago. Thomas hadn't just known about this. He had been using it. Ruth looked down at the box. No label, no markings, just aged wood and a small metal latch at the front. Her reflection faintly visible in its surface. For a moment, she didn't touch it. Because she understood something now, something deeper than logic. This wasn't just something her brother had left behind. This was something he had protected. Something their father had built into the very structure of the house itself. Which meant this secret didn't start with Thomas. It started long before him. Ruth slowly sat down. The room felt different now. Smaller. As if the walls themselves were listening. She placed her hand on the lid of the box. Paused. Because deep down, she already knew. The moment she opened it, everything she believed about her family, about her past, about who she was, would begin to fall apart. And yet, she didn't walk away. Because some truths don't wait forever. Some are built into walls, hidden in plain sight, and passed down silently to the one person who was never supposed to ignore them. Ruth Lancaster had spent 72 years believing her life was complete. But standing in that room, with her hand resting on a box that had been waiting decades to be found, she realized something chilling. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. Ruth Lancaster didn't open the box right away. Instead, she sat there in silence, her hand resting lightly on the lid, as if she could feel something inside it, something waiting. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet she was used to. This was different. Heavy. As if the moment itself had weight. Finally, she lifted the latch. It opened with a soft metallic click that sounded far too loud in the stillness of the room. Ruth raised the lid slowly. Inside, there were no jewels, no money, no obvious valuables. Just papers. Carefully arranged. Deliberately preserved. The top document was a photograph. Old, slightly faded. Ruth picked it up and her breath caught. It was her father, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. Both of them were younger, much younger, and they were standing in front of a building Ruth had never seen before. A large, industrial structure surrounded by fencing and warning signs. On the back of the photograph, written in her father's handwriting, were 3 words. Do not trust them. Ruth's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the photo. Them. She set it aside and reached for the next document. A series of typed reports. Government headers. Dates spanning over 20 years. Her eyes moved quickly across the page, then slowed, then stopped. Because she recognized something she wasn't supposed to recognize. Her father's name. Not mentioned casually. Not referenced indirectly, but listed repeatedly. In official records, Ruth's heartbeat shifted not faster, but deeper. Each line she read peeled something away. Project codes, restricted areas, surveillance notes, and then a section labeled Subject Lancaster, Thomas. Ruth froze. Her brother, she read it again. And again, it wasn't a mistake. It was a file. A monitored file. Her brother hadn't just lived in that house. He had been watched. For years. Ruth's hand trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming precision of what she was seeing. Every movement, every routine, documented. Why, she turned the page. And that's when everything broke open. A letter, handwritten, her father's writing. But this time, it wasn't calm or measured. It was urgent. The ink pressed harder into the paper, the lines uneven. Ruth read, If you are reading this, then something has already gone wrong. She stopped breathing for a moment, then continued. I tried to keep this from both of you, from Thomas most of all, but they didn't stop watching. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I kept everything contained, It would end with me. I was wrong. Ruth's grip tightened. They are not interested in the land anymore. Not just the land. It's what's under it. What we found. It was never meant to be found. Ruth's eyes flicked back to the photograph, the building, the fencing. I refused to cooperate. That's when they shifted their attention to the house, to the family, to Thomas. Her chest tightened. I built the compartment because I knew I wouldn't have time to explain everything. If you find this, you need to understand this was never about money. It was about control. Ruth's mind was racing now, connecting pieces she didn't even know she had. They will come back. They always do. And when they do, they won't ask. They will take. The final line was written darker than the rest. If it's you reading this, Ruth, then you were the one I trusted to finish this. Silence filled the room again. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was alive with meaning. Ruth lowered the letter slowly, her hands no longer steady. Her entire life, everything she believed about her father, her brother, her childhood had just been rewritten in a matter of minutes. This wasn't a hidden memory. This wasn't a forgotten past. This was something active, something unfinished. And suddenly, the house didn't feel still anymore. It felt exposed. Ruth turned her head slightly, her eyes moving toward the doorway of the study. Had it always been that dark out there? Or had she just not noticed? A subtle sound broke the silence. Not loud, but wrong. The faint creak of wood, somewhere else in the house. Ruth didn't move at first. Her body went completely still, every sense sharpening at once. Because one thought, clear and undeniable, rose above all the others. She was not alone. The letter slipped slightly in her hand as another sound followed. Closer this time. Measured. Intentional. And in that moment, Ruth Lancaster understood something with terrifying clarity. The secret she had just uncovered had never been buried. It had been guarded. Ruth Lancaster did not scream. She did not call out. She didn't even stand up right away. Because in that moment, sitting in her father's study, the letter still trembling slightly in her hand, something inside her shifted. Not suddenly, not violently, but completely. For 72 years, Ruth had believed in order, in logic, in the quiet assumption that the world, while imperfect, still followed rules that could be understood if you paid enough attention. That belief had guided her entire life. It had made her a respected educator, a woman people trusted, a woman who believed that truth, once uncovered, would settle things. But now, truth didn't feel stabilizing. It felt dangerous. She read the letter again, slower this time, not as a daughter searching for meaning, but as someone analyzing a threat. They will come back. The words no longer sounded like fear. They sounded like certainty. Ruth's eyes moved across the rest of the documents, but now she wasn't just reading them, she was studying them. Patterns, dates, names repeated in different formats. The same locations referenced in multiple reports. This wasn't random. This was a system. And her father had been part of it, or worse, had been trying to escape it. Ruth slowly placed the letter down on the desk. The sound she had heard moments ago. She replayed it in her mind. Measured, intentional. Not the settling of an old house. Not the wind. Someone had been inside, or still was. And suddenly, fear, real fear, should have taken over. But it didn't, because something stronger had already taken its place. Clarity! Ruth stood up. Slowly, deliberately. Her movements were no longer hesitant. Because the woman who had walked into this house 3 days ago, grieving, uncertain, expecting nothing more than memories. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone who understood that this was not about the past. This was happening now. She moved toward the bookshelf, paused, then gently pushed it back into place, sealing the hidden compartment once more. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Protect the information. Control the environment. She didn't even realize she was thinking like this. But she was, and that realization changed something deeper than anything else. Her father hadn't just left her documents. He had left her a role. Ruth stepped into the hallway. Dark, quiet. The house felt different now, not unfamiliar, but revealed. Every shadow sharper, every sound more precise. She walked slowly toward the staircase, her eyes adjusting, her mind already working through possibilities. If someone had entered the house, they hadn't forced their way in. No broken locks, no signs of damage, which meant either they had a key or they had been here before. Ruth stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Her gaze lifted upward. The second floor? Thomas's room. The place he had spent most of his time. The place where, according to the files, he had been watched for years. Ruth felt something tighten in her chest. Not grief. Not anymore. Understanding. Thomas hadn't stayed in this house because he was afraid to leave. He had stayed because he knew something. Something she was only beginning to understand now. And whatever it was, it had cost him his life. Ruth turned away from the stairs. Not yet. She wasn't ready to go up there. Not until she understood more. Because rushing now would be a mistake. And she had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that mistakes in this situation would not be forgiven. She returned to the study, closing the door behind her quietly. Then she did something she had never done before in this house. She locked it. The click echoed softly in the silence. Ruth leaned against the door for a moment, her eyes closing briefly, not in fear, but in focus. Everything had changed. Not just what she knew, but who she was inside this story. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the last to know. She was now the one holding the truth. And that truth came with responsibility, with danger, with consequences she couldn't yet fully see. Ruth opened her eyes, walked back to the desk, and began organizing the documents into neat, precise stacks. Not because she needed order, but because she needed control over something, over anything. Because for the first time in her life, Ruth Lancaster understood something her father had known all along. Some truths are not meant to set you free. Some truths put you directly in the line of fire. And once you see them, you don't get to step back. You don't get to forget. You don't get to return to who you were before. Ruth looked at the hidden compartment now sealed once again behind the bookshelf. Then at the door she had locked. Then at her own reflection in the dark window, 72 years old. And just now beginning to understand the real world she had been living in all along. She straightened her shoulders, because whatever was coming next, she would not face it as the woman she used to be. She would face it as the woman her father had been preparing her to become. Ruth Lancaster didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to slow down. Every word in her father's letter, every detail in those documents, every sound she had heard in the house, it all circled back, over and over, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. This wasn't just a secret. It was a system. And systems, Ruth knew, always had weaknesses. By morning, something inside her had settled. Not the situation, but her role in it. She was no longer reacting. She was thinking. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea, the documents spread out in front of her in careful rows. She began mapping it out. Dates, locations, names, and then she saw it. A sequence. The reports weren't random observations. They were tied to specific moments. Moments when something had happened near the property. Unusual readings. Ground disturbances. Energy fluctuations. Her father had written about what's under the land. At first, Ruth had assumed it was metaphorical. Now she wasn't so sure. She pulled one document closer, reading the technical language again, but this time, slower. There it was. Repeated, carefully worded, avoiding direct explanation, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. Whatever had been discovered beneath this land, it wasn't supposed to be public, and it wasn't fully understood. Ruth leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. For the first time, a different kind of thought entered her mind. Not fear, not confusion, opportunity. Because if people had spent decades watching this place, if her father had gone to such lengths to hide it, if her brother had stayed behind to protect it, then whatever this was, it had value. Not just financial. Strategic. Controlled. And right now, it belonged to her. The realization didn't feel empowering at first. It felt heavy. But then something shifted. Ruth reached for her phone. Paused. Then, instead of dialing, she opened the contacts and scrolled. There was one name she hadn't spoken to in years. Dr. Alan Pierce, a former colleague from her time in education, now a geophysicist working with independent research institutions. Someone intelligent, careful, and most importantly, not connected to anything official. Ruth stared at his name for a long moment. Then she called. He answered on the third ring. Ruth. His surprise was immediate. I need your help, she said. No explanation, no small talk. A pause followed. Then his voice changed. Tell me where you are. By afternoon, Ruth had done something she never imagined herself doing. She drove into town, not for groceries, not for errands, but to gather supplies, flashlights, batteries, a portable scanner, things she didn't fully know how to use, but intended to learn, because waiting was no longer an option. If someone had been in the house the night before, then time was not on her side. When she returned, the house felt different again. Not threatening, focused, like a place preparing for something. Ruth didn't hesitate this time. She went straight to the study, closed the door, unlocked the hidden compartment, and removed the box once more. But this time, she wasn't just reading. She was working, photographing each document, cataloging every page, creating copies. Because if her father had taught her anything, it was this: never keep everything in one place. Hours passed without her noticing. Outside, the light shifted from afternoon to evening. And still, she worked. Piece by piece, the story became clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Enough to understand one critical truth. This land, this house, wasn't just a location. It was a point of interest, a target. And now, it was hers to control. Ruth stood up slowly, her back stiff, her eyes tired but sharp. For 72 years, she had lived a life defined by structure given to her by others. Rules, expectations, roles. But this was different. This was hers, her decision, her risk, her future. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkening yard. For a moment, everything was still, peaceful, almost deceptively normal. Then she spoke quietly, more to herself than anyone else. If you've been watching this house, she paused, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Then you're about to see something you didn't expect. Because Ruth Lancaster had made a decision. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. And she certainly wasn't going to let this story end the way it was designed to. Whatever her father had started, whatever her brother had died protecting, she was going to finish it, on her terms. And for the first time since stepping into that house, Ruth didn't feel like she had uncovered a burden. She felt like she had been handed something rare, a second life, a final chapter, a chance, not just to understand the truth, but to control it. Ruth Lancaster had spent her entire life following rules she never questioned. Wake early, work hard, trust what is given, respect what is established. For 72 years, those rules had shaped her into someone dependable, predictable, safe. But now, none of those rules applied anymore. And for the first time in her life, Ruth didn't feel lost without them. She felt sharpened by their absence. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It began quietly. In small decisions, the first was simple. She stopped moving through the house like a guest. No more hesitation, no more careful steps as if she were afraid to disturb something. This was her house, her ground, her responsibility, and that shift, subtle but powerful, changed everything. She started with the perimeter. Each morning, Ruth walked the property line, slowly, deliberately. Not for exercise, for awareness. She noticed things she never would have seen before. A section of fence slightly bent inward. Footprints near the back tree line that didn't match her own. the faint impression of tire tracks on a dirt path that hadn't been used in years. Someone had been here, recently, and instead of fear, Ruth felt confirmation. She wasn't imagining it. She was already inside the truth. Back in the house, she worked with precision. The documents were no longer just information. They were tools. She created duplicates, stored them in separate locations, one inside the house, one hidden outside, one prepared to be sent if anything went wrong. Because she understood now. Control didn't come from knowing everything. It came from making sure no one else could take it away. When Dr. Alan Pierce arrived 2 days later, he didn't find the same woman he remembered. Ruth greeted him at the door not with relief, but with clarity. "You're late," she said. He blinked, surprised, then smiled slightly. "Good to see you too." Inside, she didn't explain everything at once. She showed him the documents, the patterns, the data points she had mapped out herself. Alan read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. "This isn't theoretical," he said quietly. "I know," Ruth replied. He studied her for a moment longer. "You've already figured that out." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because the truth was, the woman who once relied on others to interpret the world for her, was gone. In her place was someone who observed first, then decided. Over the next few days, they worked together. Alan brought equipment, sensors, mapping tools. But Ruth brought something he didn't expect. Instinct. She knew where to look. Not because she had technical training, but because she understood the house, the land, the patterns left behind by people who thought no one was paying attention. At one point, Alan paused and looked at her, almost unsettled. "You're not guessing, are you?" Ruth shook her head. No, because she wasn't. She was seeing, really seeing for the first time in her life, and what she saw changed how she viewed everything. Her father hadn't been secretive out of fear. He had been strategic. Her brother hadn't been passive. He had been patient. And she had not been protected because she was weak. She had been protected because she was meant to step in, at the exact moment she was ready. That realization settled deep inside her, not as pressure, but as purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ruth stood alone at the edge of the property. The air was cool, still. She looked out over the land no longer as a memory, not as inheritance, but as something alive, something chosen. 72 years old, and only now stepping into the life that had been waiting for her all along. She thought about the woman she had been just weeks ago. Careful, trusting, unaware. That version of her would have walked away, would have called authorities, would have handed this responsibility to someone else. But this version of Ruth, she didn't hand things over. She built, she decided, she acted. A faint sound echoed from the distance, metal against metal. Ruth didn't turn immediately. She didn't react. Because she had learned something far more powerful than fear: timing. She waited, counted the seconds, then slowly looked toward the source. Nothing visible, but she smiled slightly. Because now she understood something they didn't expect. She wasn't the same woman they had been watching. Not anymore. And whatever came next, they wouldn't be dealing with someone unprepared. They would be dealing with someone who had finally become exactly who she was meant to be. Ruth Lancaster was no longer uncovering the truth. She was becoming part of it. The first time Ruth Lancaster saw the lights, she didn't panic. She stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and watched as two vehicles slowed near the edge of her property. They didn't come closer. Not yet. But they were there, waiting, observing, the way they always had. Only this time, everything was different. Because Ruth was no longer the woman they had been watching for years. She didn't move away from the window. She didn't turn off the lights. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen them. Instead, she set her cup down carefully and walked to the study. Inside, everything was already prepared. Copies of every document, digital backups, encrypted files Dr. Alan Pierce had helped her create, and most importantly, A sequence. If anything happened to her, if anyone tried to take what was hers, the truth wouldn't disappear. It would spread. Ruth stood in the center of the room, looking at the bookshelf that once hid everything from her. Now it hid nothing. Because the real power had never been the secret itself. It was the moment someone decided to stop protecting it for the wrong reasons and start using it for the right ones. Her phone vibrated softly on the desk. A message from Alan. Signal detected again. They're closer than before. Ruth read it once, then placed the phone back down. No hesitation. No fear. Because she had already made her decision days ago. She walked back outside. The air was colder now, sharper. The vehicles were still there, but one of them had moved slightly forward. Testing. Ruth stepped off the porch. One step, then another, until she stood fully in the open, visible, unhidden. And then she raised her hand, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. A silent message. I see you. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine of one vehicle shut off. The other followed. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried tension. Recognition. Because whoever was out there, they understood something now. She wasn't running. Ruth took another step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, steady. You've had decades, she said into the quiet. No reply. You watched my father. A pause. You watched my brother. Still nothing. Then Ruth's voice shifted just slightly. Stronger. But you don't get to watch me. The words settled into the air like something final. Unmovable. And in that moment, the balance changed. Because power was never just about control. It was about who refused to be controlled. The driver's side door of the nearest vehicle opened slightly, then stopped, as if whoever was inside had reconsidered. Ruth didn't move, didn't step back, didn't break eye contact with the darkness beyond the headlights. Minutes passed, long enough for the moment to stretch, to become something neither side could ignore. And then the door closed. The engine started. One vehicle turned first, then the other. Gravel shifted under tires as they pulled away from the edge of the property and disappeared down the road. Gone? Ruth stood there long after the sound of the engines faded. Not because she expected them to come back immediately, but because she understood something deeper. This wasn't an ending. It was a line drawn, a boundary they hadn't expected her to create. She turned slowly and walked back toward the house. The porch creaked under her steps. The door opened easily in her hand. And inside, everything felt different again. Not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, claimed. She moved through the house without hesitation, turning off lights, closing doors, restoring the quiet, but this time, it was her quiet. Not inherited, not borrowed. Earned. Later that night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the same place her father had once sat, looking out over the same stretch of land. But she wasn't remembering him. Not in the way she used to. She understood him now. The choices, the silence, the preparation. He hadn't been hiding the truth. He had been waiting for the right person to carry it forward. And now, she was... Ruth took a slow sip of her coffee. Outside, the land stretched into darkness, calm and untouched. But beneath it, something remained. Something powerful. Something worth protecting. And for the first time in her life, Ruth Lancaster didn't feel like she had inherited a burden. She felt like she had claimed her place, not as someone who survived the past, but as someone who defined what came next. Ruth Lancaster's story is not just about secrets, surveillance, or hidden truths buried beneath a house. It is about something far more powerful. It is about timing and the quiet truth that sometimes life doesn't reveal itself to you until you are strong enough to face it. For 72 years, Ruth believed she was living a complete life, a safe life, a life built on understanding. But what she didn't realize was this. She wasn't late to the truth. She was being prepared for it. We often think strength comes from experience, from success, from control. But real strength comes from something deeper. The ability to adapt when everything you believed turns out to be incomplete. Ruth didn't break when her reality changed. She evolved. She didn't run from what was hidden. She stepped toward it. And that is the difference between people who are defined by their past and those who redefine their future. Because the truth is, it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Sometimes it just takes one moment, one discovery. To begin, if this story made you think differently about your own life, subscribe now and join us every week for powerful stories that prove it's never too late to start over.